The studio lights were warm, almost comforting, but the air felt tight the moment Ricky Gervais took his seat. The applause that greeted him was loud, enthusiastic, yet uneven, as if part of the audience wasn't quite sure whether they were welcoming a beloved comedian or bracing for a storm. Ricky acknowledged the crowd with a small nod, relaxed shoulders, that familiar half-smile that suggested he was already amused by the situation. Joy Behar sat across from him, papers neatly stacked, glasses resting low on her nose. She smiled too, but hers carried a sharp edge, the practiced look of someone who knew how to steer a conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. The opening minutes were light. They talked about Ricky's latest project, his trademark humor, the global tours, the sold-out shows. Laughter rolled easily across the studio, punctuated by applause. Ricky leaned back, hands loosely folded, delivering quick, dry remarks that landed effortlessly. He seemed completely at ease, tossing jokes into the room like pebbles into water, watching the ripples form. Joy played along at first, teasing him about being controversial, the audience chuckling as if this were all familiar territory. But then Joy shifted in her chair. The papers in her hands lowered slightly, and her tone changed, subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would catch it. She asked whether comedy, especially Ricky's brand of it, had crossed a line in recent years. Whether there was a difference between being bold and being cruel. The laughter faded, replaced by a low murmur. Cameras tightened their focus. Ricky didn't answer right away. He didn't interrupt or deflect. He simply listened, eyes steady, expression neutral. Joy pressed on, framing her point carefully. She spoke about responsibility, about public figures and influence, about how jokes could hurt people who didn't have the same platform to respond. Her voice was calm but firm, and the audience could feel the tension rising like static. Ricky nodded occasionally, acknowledging her words, still silent. That silence grew heavier by the second. It wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. The kind of pause that suggested he was choosing every word before letting it out. When Ricky finally leaned forward, the shift in his posture alone drew attention. He placed his hands on the table, fingers lightly touching, and smiled faintly. It wasn't dismissive or defensive. It was thoughtful. He began by thanking Joy for the question, which earned a small, surprised reaction from the crowd. Then he spoke slowly, clearly, without raising his voice. He said comedy wasn't about cruelty, it was about honesty. About pointing out absurdities that everyone could see but few were willing to name. Each sentence was delivered with precision, stripped of unnecessary flair, making it impossible to misinterpret. The audience listened closely now. Ricky talked about satire as a mirror, not a weapon. A mirror that reflected society back at itself, flaws and all. He explained that when people felt uncomfortable, it wasn't always because they were being attacked, but because they recognized something true. His words didn't accuse or belittle, they invited reflection. Joy tried to interject once, but Ricky continued, not cutting her off, simply finishing his thought with calm authority. He mentioned that comedy had always pushed boundaries, long before social media magnified every moment. That laughter, even when it stung, could open conversations that silence never would. As he spoke, the studio seemed to settle into a different rhythm. The tension didn't vanish, but it transformed into focus. Heads nodded in the audience. A few people clapped softly, unsure if applause was appropriate yet. Joy responded with a raised eyebrow, challenging him again, suggesting that some boundaries existed for a reason. Ricky didn't bristle. He smiled, almost warmly, and acknowledged that boundaries mattered. But, he added, boundaries also needed to be questioned, because unquestioned limits often protected comfort, not truth. The way he said it wasn't confrontational, it was explanatory, as if he were laying out an idea rather than winning an argument. The cameras cut briefly to the co-hosts, their expressions revealing surprise and curiosity more than disagreement. This wasn't the explosive exchange people might have expected. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more powerful. Ricky spoke about audiences being smarter than they were often given credit for. About trusting people to understand context, nuance, and intent. He joked lightly about how comedians were blamed for society's problems while politicians got away with far worse, and that line finally broke the tension. Laughter erupted, genuine and loud, echoing through the studio. Joy laughed too, though her smile was tighter now. She pushed back once more, but the momentum had shifted. Ricky wasn't on the defensive, he was guiding the conversation. He spoke about empathy, about laughing at ideas rather than individuals, about the difference between punching down and punching up. He made it clear that his targets were hypocrisy and power, not vulnerability. His voice never rose, never sharpened, yet every word seemed to land exactly where it needed to. The audience could feel it. This wasn't a clash fueled by anger, it was a dismantling built on clarity. Ricky's calmness contrasted sharply with the expectation of chaos, and that contrast made his points even stronger. Joy listened now more than she spoke, occasionally nodding, occasionally pursing her lips, clearly recalibrating her approach. As the segment neared its end, the applause came again, louder than before, sustained and confident. Ricky leaned back in his chair, the faint smile returning, as if the moment had passed exactly as he expected it to. The studio lights still glowed warmly, but the air felt different now, lighter somehow, as though something unspoken had finally been said out loud. Joy tried again, sharper now, suggesting responsibility meant restraint, that comedy in a fractured world should heal rather than provoke. Her voice carried a firmness that signaled she wasn't ready to concede the point. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the conversation approaching a crossroads. Ricky didn't rush to respond. He took a breath, glanced briefly toward the crowd, and then back at Joy, as if acknowledging that this wasn't just a conversation between two people, but a moment playing out in front of millions. He smiled, not smug or dismissive, but thoughtful, and said restraint was a choice, not a moral commandment handed down from above. He explained that comedians chose their words every day, but choosing honesty over comfort often came with consequences. He spoke about how laughter had always been a pressure valve, a way for societies to confront uncomfortable truths without tearing themselves apart. His tone remained calm, almost conversational, but the substance of his words carried weight. Joy leaned back slightly, arms folding for a moment, then unfolding again as she countered that intent didn't erase impact. That people hearing the jokes didn't always know the comedian's heart. Ricky nodded, acknowledging the point without surrendering his own. He said impact mattered, of course it did, but impact couldn't be measured in isolation from context. He argued that assuming bad faith from every joke stripped audiences of their intelligence and reduced comedy to something sanitized and hollow. The room grew quiet again, not tense this time, but attentive. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to pause. Ricky leaned forward, hands open, palms visible, a subtle gesture of transparency. He talked about trust, about trusting audiences to think, to disagree, to laugh or not laugh without needing a referee to explain what they should feel. He joked lightly that if comedians had to file a permission slip for every punchline, comedy would die of paperwork. The audience laughed, the sound breaking through the seriousness like sunlight through clouds. Joy smiled at that, a real smile this time, though she wasn't done. She suggested that some jokes reinforced power structures rather than challenging them. Ricky responded without missing a beat, saying bad comedy did that, not comedy itself. He drew a line between lazy cruelty and crafted satire, between mocking weakness and exposing hypocrisy. His words were precise, deliberate, as if he were carefully separating two ideas that were often lumped together. The co-hosts exchanged glances, sensing the balance shift again. One of them nodded subtly as Ricky spoke, another raised an eyebrow in thought. This wasn't a shouting match or a walk-off moment. It was something rarer, a public disagreement unfolding with clarity instead of chaos. Joy asked whether there was ever a moment when a comedian should step back. Ricky answered that comedians stepped back all the time, usually when they realized a joke wasn't funny. But stepping back because of fear, he said, was different from stepping back because of growth. He shared a brief reflection about learning over the years, about jokes he wouldn't tell anymore not because someone demanded it, but because he'd outgrown them. The admission softened the room. It showed evolution without apology, accountability without self-flagellation. The audience responded with quiet applause, the kind that comes from recognition rather than excitement. Joy listened closely now, her posture less confrontational, her questions more curious than challenging. She asked whether he worried about alienating people. Ricky shrugged lightly and said alienation was sometimes the price of honesty. He added that comedy wasn't meant to be a group hug, it was meant to make people think, sometimes by making them uncomfortable first. He emphasized that discomfort wasn't the enemy of progress, complacency was. As the conversation continued, it became clear that what many expected to be an explosive clash had turned into a philosophical exchange. Ricky's calm demeanor never wavered. He didn't raise his voice, didn't interrupt, didn't resort to sarcasm or insults. Instead, he dismantled arguments with patience, humor, and clarity. Joy, for her part, pushed when she felt it mattered and listened when she sensed the audience leaning in. Near the end of the segment, Joy posed one final question, asking whether he believed comedy could change minds. Ricky paused longer this time, considering it carefully. He said comedy didn't change minds the way arguments did. It opened doors. It planted seeds. Sometimes it just made people laugh and feel less alone, and that, he said, mattered more than winning any debate. The audience erupted into applause, louder and more unified than before. Joy nodded slowly, then smiled and thanked him for the conversation. The tension that once filled the studio had dissolved into something closer to mutual respect. The cameras pulled back, capturing the broader scene, a host and a guest who hadn't agreed on everything, but had met each other with words instead of weapons. As the applause faded, Ricky leaned back in his chair again, that familiar half-smile returning, not triumphant but satisfied. The moment lingered, not because of outrage or spectacle, but because of its restraint. In a media landscape hungry for conflict, this exchange stood out precisely because it refused to become one. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the show moved on, but the impact of the conversation stayed, echoing beyond the set, long after the cameras stopped rolling.